Hello, I'd like to share with you today some information about the death penalty in the United States of America. The information for this presentation came from two sources: the Death Penalty Information Center and the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. They have some nice data sets there that you can go download and explore yourself. There'll be some information about those individuals sitting on death row in the United States, those individuals who are still alive but waiting execution. And then the second part of this will be information and statistics related to those who have actually been executed in the United States since 1976. A couple of historical events with the Supreme Court. In Furman v. Georgia, the Supreme Court essentially suspends the death penalty in the United States. But then another Supreme Court case later on in 1976, the death penalty was reinstated. The reason these two results are important is because the databases will be looking at the executions since 1976. All right, so looking at the number sitting on death row, it's the first part of this. You can see the number of states that have the death penalty and the number of individuals sitting on death row in those states. The most number of inmates sitting on death row is California, but interestingly enough, California has put a moratorium on death penalty executions. And other two states would be Oregon and Colorado. The federal government and military also has a death penalty, and there are 66 individuals sitting on death row there. New Hampshire in the Northeast has a single person sitting on death row, but they have since eliminated the death penalty. When you look at the racial background of those sitting on death row, those 2,620 sitting on death row, we know that in the general U.S. population, there are about 5 times as many whites as blacks. Yet, there are about an equal number of blacks and whites sitting on death row. Only 13% of Americans are black, yet 3 times this rate, or 42%, of death row inmates are black. Blacks are disproportionately sentenced to death in the United States. If we look at the overall practices in the states, the blue states there, you can see those are states that do not have the death penalty. 21 states and Washington, D.C. do not have the death penalty. There are many other states indicated in purple there that have the death penalty, but they have not executed anyone within the last 5 years. The lighter states in the central and southern regions, those states do have the death penalty and they have executed individuals over the last 5 years. If we look at death row in the states, here you see 8 different states that have over 100 inmates on death row. California, to the far left, has 725. And then you see the other states there that have many individuals on death row. We pointed out earlier that California has more than double the number of death row inmates of any other state, but they also have a moratorium on executions. You can see in most of these states listed that more blacks sit on death row than whites, despite the population of blacks in these states being significantly lower than the white populations. The 2 exceptions that you see in this graph are Florida and Arizona, where the number of white defendants exceeds the number of black defendants. Another look at some of the states. These 10 states are the states that have where more than half of the death row inmates are black. In Louisiana, over 2/3 of the death row inmates are black. We're now going to look at the executions. So those that we described before are living. They're sitting on death row awaiting execution. Now we're going to move into those who have actually been executed. And you can see what the database looks like here. There are about 1,512 persons that have been executed since 1976. And this particular database contains the date of the execution, the name of the defendant, the age of the defendant, the sex of the defendant, the race of the defendant, also information about the victims, the number of victims involved, the race and the sex of the victims, the state where the execution was performed, the county, the region. They break down the U.S. into 4 different regions, and then the method of execution. Here are some individuals who are listed in the execution database that you may be familiar with. So first, let's look at the method of execution. You can see overwhelmingly that the preferred method of execution is lethal injection. Electrocution is next, and then you have some other less common ways of executing. In some states, they give the defendant a choice as to the method of execution. Here's a graph that depicts the number of executions over time. You can see that it started off slowly. It takes a while from the time someone is sentenced to the time that they are executed, and very few are executed in the early years. But then the executions grew dramatically till it reached a peak in 1999, and then the number of executions have decreased since that time. If you look at the race of those who were executed, there are more whites executed than any other race. The blacks, 34% of the executions were black. And this is where we point to an inequity, because only 13% of the U.S. population is black, but 34% of the state-sanctioned executions involved black defendants. Here's a similar map to the one before, but this now represents executions. The darker colors, like Texas, represent where a larger number of executions occurred. And in some states, you can see 1 or 2 or 3, very few executions. Some states, many, many executions. There have been 6 federal and military executions. Hawaii and Alaska do not have the death penalty, so they're not depicted here. If you look at the region of the country where the executions have occurred, overwhelmingly, most executions occur in those south and southeastern states. Only 6% of the executions appear in the western states, 12 in the upper Midwest, 12% in the upper Midwest, and less than 1% in the Northeast. If you look over time, the average time between sentencing and execution, early on, the average time spent on death row from sentencing to execution was about 6 years. However, more recently, in the most recent years, the average time from sentencing to execution is about 20 years. So the time on death row is increasing. If we look at the age of the individuals who were executed since 1976, the average age is about 40 years old. 25% of those executed were between the ages of 22 and 34. 50% were between 34 and 48 years old. And 25% of those executed were older than 48 years old. You can see that 7 individuals were executed who were at least 70 years old and higher. If we're going to look at inequities in the death penalty, we must consider the race of the victims. You can see in this slide that we have many more victims than we do executions. About 76% of all the victims were white. The gender of the victims, it's pretty much a 50-50 split. And you can see that some of the victim statistics might be swayed a little bit because of that building was blown up in Oklahoma City. There were 168 victims, and 129 of them were white, 32 black, 5 Latino, and 2 Native American. So we'll look at more details of the race of the victim in the coming slides. Okay, in this slide we compare the race of the defendant with the race of the victims. As you'll notice from looking at this graph, that it's rare that a white person would be executed for killing a non-white person. You can also see that it would be very unusual for a white or a Hispanic defendant to be executed for killing a black person. You also see that it would be very unusual for a white or a black person to be executed for killing a Hispanic person. But when white victims are involved, you see a higher percentage of those from other races who are sentenced to death. If you want to look at interracial murders since 1996, blacks are much more likely to be executed for killing a white person than whites are for killing a black person. There are several studies that go in and look at murder cases in general in states that have the death penalty, and they look at what were the outcomes of the murder cases. And you can see the Florida death sentences from 1977 to 2019. Florida has been handing out the death sentence at a lower rate in recent years, but in those 2 years, 76 to 77, for those murder cases, there were 326 of them where they gave the death penalty in 36 of them. So most of the time, 89% of the first-degree murder cases, the defendant was not sentenced to death. It's only about 10% of the time, 10 or 11% of the time, that individuals are sentenced to death over this period in the state of Florida. So, if you compare the percentage of whites that were sentenced to death in Florida in this period and the percentage of whites, you'll find that whites were sentenced to death 11.9% of the time, whereas blacks were sentenced to death 10.2% of the time. If we stop our analysis here, there does not appear to be a racial inequity. And this is why we look at the race of the victim. If you take that same data, that table at the top, and you break it down into the white victims table and the black victims table. So in those murder cases, those death sentences, death penalty cases in Florida, there are 36 of them. 30 involved white victims and 6 involved black victims. What were the outcomes? The left table there, where it describes the white victims, when white victims are involved, white murderers, white defendants are sentenced to death 12.6% of the time, whereas black defendants were sentenced to higher 17.5% of the time. And when you go to the black victims table to the right, you'll see that white defendants were never sentenced to death when a black person was killed, whereas black defendants were sentenced to death only 5.8% of the time. So when you hear people talk about Black Lives Matter, here would be a situation using data where we see a systemic inequality here, where when a black victim is involved, they receive justice at a lower rate than white victims. There are many other studies out there for further review that focus in on a specific set of executions or death penalty cases in various states. And in 96% of states where there have been reviews like this on race and the death penalty, there was a pattern of either race of victim or race of defendant discrimination, or both. They say that to eliminate some of these inequities that we see in our society, the first step is to recognize that there are differences among the races. And once we understand that there are differences, our next step is to try to do something to combat those inequalities, those inequities. And thanks for watching. And I hope you learned something about the death penalty.